I still remember the sound of the heart monitor in the hospital room, steady and cold, as if nothing in the world had just shattered moments before. My son was lying right beside me, so small my hand could cover his entire face, and I had just been through a C-section less than 3 hours ago, my body still trembling from the anesthesia and pain. My husband said he had to step out to take an urgent call. His voice was so calm that I didn't suspect a thing, at least not until I tried to get out of bed to find him, just to ask for a glass of water. The door to the room wasn't completely closed. And then I heard his voice, but it wasn't the voice he used with me. Low, soft, and almost tender. "I know, my love. Just a little more time. She still doesn't know anything. I'm just playing my part." I stood there, frozen. "My real family is waiting here. I'll be home soon." I don't know how long I stood there, only that, in that moment, something inside me broke completely. If I wasn't his family, then for all these years, what was I? And the man standing out there, who was he, really? My name is Elena Carter. I'm 33 years old. I live in Austin, Texas. And if you had met me a few weeks ago, you would have thought I was the kind of woman who had everything in her life figured out. I run an interior design studio specializing in commercial spaces, not the glamorous kind you see in magazines, but real projects, small cafes, startup offices, places where real people actually live and work every day. I love the feeling of stepping into an empty room and imagining what it could become, the idea that everything has a reason for being there, from the lighting and the colors to every single chair. You could say I'm a practical person, a bit tough, but I've always believed that if you build something solid enough, it won't fall apart easily. Maybe that's why I believed in my marriage. I met Daniel Brooks on a March evening at a rooftop bar overlooking the Colorado River. The Austin spring was just beginning, the breeze was light, music was playing from a corner, and people were talking as if there was no rush. I wasn't planning on staying long, just stopping by after a long day at work, still in the blazer and high heels that were making my feet ache. Daniel was the kind of person you couldn't help but notice. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he was the one everyone's eyes eventually landed on. Tall, with a straight posture and a deep, clear voice, he had a way of listening that made you feel important. He talked about very ordinary things at first. Our jobs, the city, the places we'd lived. He was a corporate lawyer specializing in mergers and acquisitions, the kind of job I never really understood, but the way he talked about it made it sound much more interesting. I remember laughing more than usual that night. And what made me trust him wasn't some grand romantic gesture, but the way he showed up in the days that followed. He didn't disappear. He called, he texted, he showed up at the right times. Never pushy, but never making me wait either. When I said I was busy, he respected it. When I was tired, he'd bring food to my doorstep and just send a simple text. "I left it here. Make sure you eat." No pressure, no games, no making me guess. For someone like me, that was worth more than any promise. He fell in love in a very logical way. It wasn't explosive, but a feeling that grew over time, like a house being built brick by brick. After a year, we moved in together into a small townhouse in South Austin, where in the mornings you could hear bicycles gliding by and smell coffee from the corner shop. That our life had its own rhythm. I'd usually wake up earlier, make coffee, and open my laptop to check on some designs, while Daniel would come down to the kitchen about 15 minutes later, his hair still a bit messy, his shirt not fully buttoned. He would always place a light kiss on my shoulder before getting his own cup of coffee, a habit he never missed. In the evenings, if I wasn't working late, we'd have dinner together, sometimes cooking, sometimes ordering in. Then we'd watch a movie that neither of us really focused on because we usually ended up talking more than watching. On some weekends, we'd drive out of the city just to walk around, buy a few random things, or sit for hours at a diner without doing anything special. It was those small, repeated things that made me feel so secure. And Daniel proposed. He didn't do anything flashy, No fancy restaurant, no crowd, just a normal evening at home. He placed the ring on the kitchen counter, right next to my glass of wine, and looked at me with more seriousness than I had ever seen in his eyes. He said, "I can't promise life will always be easy, but I promise I'll always be here." And I believed him. We were married 6 months later, a small outdoor ceremony with just family and a few close friends. Nothing extravagant, but everything was just right. When I look back at the photos from that day, I see a truly happy woman. Not a loud kind of happy, but the quiet peace that comes when you think you've found the right person. In the early years, our marriage was almost completely free of any significant problems. Daniel worked a lot, yes, but so did I. We understood each other's pressures, and neither of us asked the other to change. Money wasn't an issue. We were both independent, both had our own careers. To the outside world, we were the model couple people always talked about. Successful, balanced, mature. And for me, it wasn't an act. At least until I began to realize that sometimes the things that look the most solid are the ones cracking from the inside without you even knowing. The changes didn't happen all at once. They appeared in small ways, almost unnoticeable, like a hairline crack running down a white wall that you can see. But tell yourself doesn't matter. At first, I didn't think it was a problem. Daniel started coming home later, but that was perfectly reasonable given his job. Big deals, long meetings, clients who never cared about the time. He always had a reason, and those reasons sounded convincing. "This week is a bit intense," he said one Wednesday evening, putting his briefcase on the table, but not taking off his tie, as if he was only stopping for a few minutes before heading out again. "The Dallas team is putting on the pressure. I have to fly over there for a few days." I nodded, not asking any more questions. My job wasn't any less demanding, and I understood the feeling of being so wrapped up in a project that everything else fades into the background. But then, the small details started to appear. His phone. Before, Daniel wasn't the secretive type. He'd leave his phone anywhere. On the kitchen counter, the sofa, sometimes he'd even forget it in the car. But lately, that phone had practically become a part of his body. It always face down, always within reach. If a message came in, he would glance at it quickly, almost reflexively, then pick it up immediately. It wasn't a deliberate act of hiding, but more like a reflex that had been practiced too many times. As I noticed, but I didn't say anything. That partly because I didn't want to be that kind of person, the suspicious type, and partly because I had enough reasons to make excuses for him. A corporate lawyer, sensitive information, major clients, everything made sense. It just didn't feel right. Daniel was also changing in ways that you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention. He was still caring, still asked about my work, still sat down for dinner with me when he could. But there was something in his eyes that wasn't the same. Before, when I spoke, he truly listened. Now there were times I had to call his name twice, 3 times, to pull him back into the conversation. His gaze would sometimes drift somewhere else, as if he were in another place, with another life that I didn't know about. "Just what were you saying tonight?" he'd ask, with a small laugh, as if it were just a normal moment of distraction. I would laugh too, pretending nothing was wrong. It was nothing important. And we would carry on as if nothing had happened. The business trips also became more frequent. Daniel used to travel about once or twice a month for just a few days each time. But then the frequency increased, and the trips got longer. Some weeks, he was barely home at all. "It's just this phase," he'd say as I stood at the door, watching him pull his suitcase to the car early one morning. "After this deal is done, things will settle down." I'd nod, telling myself that everything has its cycles. But the hardest thing for me to explain wasn't his absence, but the way he came back. Sometimes he'd come home genuinely exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his voice hoarse from talking too much. But other times he'd return too normal, too neat, too calm. As if he hadn't just been on a stressful business trip, but on a perfectly arranged vacation. One evening, while he was in the shower, I went into the bedroom to get my laptop. His jacket was draped over a chair, and as I walked past, I caught a strange scent. It wasn't his cologne. A light scent, a little sweet, and it definitely wasn't mine. I stopped for a second. Just for a second. Then I kept walking as if nothing had happened. I could have asked him. I could have held up the jacket and said, "What is this smell?" But I didn't. Because once you ask that question, you can never go back to the way things were before. And at that moment, I wasn't ready to break everything. I chose to believe. Or more accurately, I chose to postpone my disbelief. The evenings grew quieter. Not the comfortable silence of two people simply being together, but the kind of silence where both of you have something left unsaid. We'd still sit next to each other on the sofa, still have the TV on, but the distance between us, even if it was only a few inches, felt wider than ever before. Once I looked over at him, about to say something, but then I just stopped. I didn't know what I was going to ask. And maybe I wasn't even sure I wanted to hear the answer. I started to wonder if I was just being overly sensitive, or if something was actually changing. But every time that thought surfaced, I'd find a way to push it back down. He can't work, as they had put pressure, timing. There were 100 logical reasons to explain everything. Except none of them could explain that feeling. The feeling that the man sitting with me every evening, the man I married, the one I trusted more than anyone, was slowly becoming a stranger. And the scariest part wasn't knowing for sure that something was wrong. It is that I was starting to realize I wasn't sure about anything anymore. Everything I had thought was difficult before was really just the beginning. My fourth pregnancy was nothing like the others. There was no joyful anticipation, no plans to decorate the nursery, no evenings spent dreaming of the future. The only thing left was a quiet fear that clung to me from the moment I woke up until I closed my eyes. I didn't trust my own body anymore. Every little twinge made my heart stop. Every trip to the bathroom, I had to brace myself for something terrible. I lived each day like I was on a tightrope, just trying to stay balanced, not daring to hope for too much, because I knew how painful the fall would be. Daniel knew I was scared. He saw it, but instead of coming closer, he drifted further away. At first, it was just late nights. Then came the long trips. Then came the short, hurried calls, as if I were just an item to be checked off his list. "I'm at the airport. Make it quick. I'm in a meeting. I'll call you back. I'm a bit busy. You should get some rest." Those lines repeated so often, I could guess them before he even opened his mouth. Some nights I would lie alone in our bedroom, my hand on my belly, feeling the baby's faint movements, and realize I had never felt so lonely. Not because I didn't have anyone, but because the one person who was supposed to be there wasn't. The house that once felt so safe now seemed too big, too quiet. My own footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as I moved from room to room, a constant reminder that I was the only one there. There were days I didn't speak to anyone. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't know what to say. I began talking to myself more, whispering nonsense while making coffee or standing in front of the mirror, trying to convince myself that everything would be all right. But deep down, I knew I was losing my grip. By my 7th month, the doctor put me on complete bed rest. My blood pressure was dangerously high. No work, no stress, no moving around much. Basically, I was forced to just lie there and think, and that was the worst part. When you run out of things to do, your mind starts to fill the silence with all the questions you've been trying to avoid. Hey, where is Daniel? What is he doing? And most importantly, does he really want to be here? Like one evening, I called him earlier than usual. It wasn't for anything important. I just needed to hear his voice. Just for a few minutes, so I wouldn't feel so completely alone in all of this. He answered after a few rings. But his voice, it wasn't the one he used with me. It was quiet, hushed, like he was trying to keep someone else from overhearing. "I'm in a meeting," he said quickly. "I'll call you back." I was about to say something. Maybe I miss you, or I'm scared. But I didn't get the chance. He'd already hung up. I stared at my phone screen for a long time, as if looking hard enough would make it light up again. It didn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to every little sound in the house. The hum of the air conditioner, the wind, the house settling. Every sound was so sharp, so clear, that I couldn't escape my own thoughts. I started counting. Counting the times he said he was busy. Counting the times he came home late. Counting the times he didn't call back. And when I was done counting, I realized I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. But I wasn't brave enough to face it. Because if I confronted it, if I asked, if I forced him to answer, I might lose everything. So I chose silence. I kept it all inside, trying to be the most agreeable version of myself. No pressure, no questions, no fuss. I made myself into someone I thought he wouldn't want to leave. That only pushed me further away from who I really was. There's one moment I remember so clearly. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a glass of water, just looking out the window. It was already dark, and the lights from the neighbors' houses shone in, creating these warm little dots of light. Somewhere out there, families were eating dinner together. Somewhere out there were women who didn't have to wait. And then I looked down, placed my hand on my belly, and felt the baby inside me. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about Daniel. I thought about whether, if it were just me and this baby, if I would be strong enough to go on. The answer came faster than I thought. Yes. That meant something else too. That some part of me had already started letting him go. I didn't find out the truth in some loud, dramatic way. There were no fights, no one standing in front of me, confessing. It was just a terrifyingly normal afternoon. An afternoon where, from the outside, no one would have guessed a woman's life had just been torn apart from the inside out. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me, trying to review old design files to keep my mind from drifting toward the thoughts I'd been avoiding for weeks. The Texas sun streamed through the glass, bright and warm, making everything look stable, like nothing had changed at all. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table right in front of me. It was a small detail, but so unusual that it made me freeze. He almost never left his phone at home, and he certainly never left it just lying on the table like that. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, a short enough time that I could have turned away and continued to pretend that everything was normal, but long enough for a very strange feeling to creep into me, a feeling I couldn't name but also couldn't ignore. The screen lit up, an email appeared, and my eyes unconsciously stopped on the subject line. Not long, not complicated, but it made my heart rate change noticeably. Payment confirmation, West Hills residence. West Hills wasn't a name that belonged in our lives. I had never heard Daniel mention it, never seen it appear in any of our conversations, and it was that very unfamiliarity that made it more conspicuous than anything else. I told myself that it was probably for work. A client, an investment project he hadn't had a chance to tell me about, because everything had always had a rational explanation, and I was used to finding reasons for him. But my hand still touched the screen. The email opened, and I knew immediately that this wasn't part of his work. It didn't have the familiar structure, no legal language, just a clear and direct payment confirmation. A very large sum of money. Not the kind of normal expense, but the kind that makes you have to stop and figure out what's going on. The recipient was a name I had never seen before, Pacific Horizon Holdings. The property address was in Portland, Oregon. I read those lines over and over, not because I didn't understand, but because I didn't want to understand, because if I did, I would have to accept that there was a part of Daniel's life that I knew absolutely nothing about. He always said we were transparent about our finances, always thought everything was clear, and only then did I realize that belief might have only existed on my side. I scrolled down and saw an attachment. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I also knew I'd gone too far to turn back, so I tapped on it. It was a real estate purchase agreement, full of detail, clear, with no room for misinterpretation, complete with signatures, dates, and everything arranged perfectly. Daniel's name appeared there several times, but not in the role I had ever imagined. Not as the husband who was building our assets with me, but as a separate individual with a financial system completely detached from mine. And then I saw the part that made everything inside me stop. The primary resident was another name, Megan Lewis. I had never heard this name before, not once during our entire marriage. But what made it impossible for me to keep breathing normally wasn't the name, but the note right below it, at primary residence for family use. Family. I sat still, completely silent, so much so that I could hear each beat of my heart, slow and heavy, as if my body was trying to keep me from collapsing right there on the spot. I tried to find an explanation, anything logical, a relative, a business deal, some kind of mistake. But the more I looked, the clearer things became in a way I couldn't distort into something else. There were recurring payments, utility bills, signs of a life happening somewhere else, a life that didn't include me. I scrolled down one more time and saw another email, this time not from a bank, but from a personal address. I opened it. Just a few short lines, but enough to shatter everything that was left. The kids keep asking when you are coming back. Oliver refused to sleep last night without you. You said Thursday. I didn't feel anything for the first few seconds. Not shock, not pain, just a cold void spreading through my chest, as if everything inside me had been taken away all at once. Kids. Not one child. Eskimo could more than one. I put the phone down and then picked it back up, rereading it, trying to find some detail that could salvage my understanding of things. But nothing changed. Everything was still clear, still there, undeniable. I looked around my kitchen, where I had chosen every detail, where every corner bore my mark, and for the first time, I realized that I might have built an entire life on a foundation I never truly understood. Daniel, my husband, the person I trusted more than anyone, the person I thought was building a family with me, had now become someone I couldn't recognize. I don't know who Megan is. I don't know who those children are. I don't know what that house in Portland really is. But I knew one thing that I could no longer turn away from. Daniel didn't just have one life, and perhaps I was never truly a part of it. I didn't cry right away, which might sound strange, but the truth is, when a shock is big enough, the body doesn't respond with tears, but with paralysis, as if all the signals in your brain are cut off at once, and you're left with just a formless void. I just sat there, in my familiar chair in the kitchen I once considered the center of my life, my hand resting on the table, my eyes on the phone but not really seeing anything, and I realized I was breathing very shallowly, each breath short and rushed, as if taking a slightly deeper one would make everything shatter, and I wouldn't be able to hold myself together anymore. My heart wasn't beating fast, but heavily, one beat at a time, like a steady knock inside my chest, making me keenly aware that I was still here, still alive, but that some part of me had already stopped. I placed my hand on my stomach, an almost unconscious reflex, feeling the presence of the baby inside, and for the first time since I became pregnant, I wasn't thinking about our future, but of a single question. How long have I not known this? That question didn't have an immediate answer, but it unlocked a chain of memories I had previously ignored. Small details, moments I had convinced myself were unimportant, now starting to piece themselves together in a terrifying way. Business trips that lasted longer than usual. Short, hurried phone calls. The phone always placed face down on the table. The strange scent on his jacket. His eyes wandering off when I spoke. All of those things, one by one, piece by piece, like scattered puzzle pieces I had deliberately refused to put together, were now automatically finding their right places. I closed my eyes, trying to push it all away, trying to hold on to a different version of the story. One where everything could still be explained in a way that didn't hurt me. Maybe this is a misunderstanding. Maybe it was company property. Maybe that email didn't mean what I think it means. Maybe. I clung to the word maybe like a thin thread over a deep chasm, knowing it could snap at any moment, but I still wouldn't let go. I picked up the phone again, rereading every line, slower, more carefully, as if by being meticulous enough, I could find some detail that would prove I had misunderstood. But nothing had changed. The words were still there, clear, with no room for a different interpretation. Kids. That thing Oliver. Coming back. Those words weren't vague. They left me no room to hide. I felt my stomach clench. A wave of nausea rose from deep inside me, not from the pregnancy, but from the truth forcing me to face it. I stood up, took a few steps toward the sink, my hands gripping the stone countertop to stay balanced. And in that moment, I realized my legs were shaking. Not just trembling, but shaking so badly I had to fight to keep myself from collapsing. My body was reacting. Late, but very real. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run, just to have a sound fill the space, because the silence was too heavy now. It made my thoughts clearer than I could bear. I looked into the small mirror hanging above the sink. The woman looking back at me had empty eyes, a pale face, and something about her that I didn't recognize, as if she had just lost something incredibly important but hadn't yet grasped what it was. I whispered to myself, almost soundlessly, "It can't be. It can't be." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it, because my body knew before my mind would accept it. A deep instinctual feeling told me that everything had changed a long time ago. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I went back to the table and sat down. This time, when I looked at the phone, I was no longer searching for an explanation. I started to see things as they really were. Another woman. Another house. Other children. Another life. Parallel to the life I thought was the only one. I thought about all the times I sat alone in this house, waiting for Daniel to come home, telling myself he was working for our future. I thought about the times I called him and heard his voice drop, quickly ending the call. I think about all the times he said he had to leave, and I just nod, trusting, never asking any more questions. All those memories weren't just individual moments anymore. They became evidence. I don't know how long I sat there, only that when I finally stood up, I was no longer the same woman who had sat down. Not stronger. Not calmer. Just clearer. Denial had peeled away, layer by layer, like old paint flaking off a wall, revealing the thing underneath that I had tried to hide for so long. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. Daniel had another life. And I, the one who shared his bed, his home, and years of my life with him, was the last one to know. I placed a hand on my stomach again, this time not for comfort, but to remind myself that something was still real, that something still belonged to me. And in that moment, another feeling emerged, no longer pure pain, but something sharper, clearer, like a precise cut. If everything I believed in could be a lie, then from now on I wouldn't believe in anything unless I saw it with my own eyes. Once the truth was undeniable, the most surprising thing wasn't the pain, but the very slow, very clear shift inside me, as if a switch had been flipped without me even noticing, and the woman who had been sitting in the kitchen just hours before, trembling and lost, began to recede. I was still in pain, that didn't disappear, but the pain no longer took up all the space in my head. It was pushed back by something else, something colder, clearer, and more orderly. I started to think. Not the panicked kind of thinking, but a structured thought process, like when I'm facing a complex blueprint and have to find its weakness. Daniel didn't just betray me. He built a system. A parallel life, organized, planned, with its own finances, its own addresses, its own people, and most importantly, its own time. That couldn't have happened in a day, not in a month, but over years. And if he could maintain all of that without me ever knowing, it meant he believed I would never find out. That if I did, I wouldn't be capable of doing anything about it. That thought didn't make me weaker. It woke me up. I looked at the phone on the table again, at the emails, the numbers, the unfamiliar names, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I started to see them as data, information, clues. If I confronted him now, I would lose. I knew that with absolute clarity. Daniel's a lawyer. He knows how to control the narrative, how to twist the truth, how to make others doubt themselves. If I called him right now, if I asked him about Megan, about the children, about the house in Portland, he would have 100 ways to answer her without actually answering. He would say I misunderstood. He would say it was for work. He would say I was being sensitive because of the pregnancy. And if I lost control, if I cried, if I got angry, I would become the unreliable one. I would become exactly who he needed me to be. An emotional, unstable, easily manipulated woman. I couldn't give him that. Not now. I took a deep breath, and for the first time since everything started, I felt the air fill my lungs completely, not cut short by fear or panic. I needed time. Not to heal, but to understand. If he could build a second life without me knowing, then I could learn about it without him knowing. I started to think about what I had, not about money, not about assets, but about my capabilities. I know how to observe. I know how to analyze. I know how to look at a system and find its weak points. That's my job. And now my marriage was no longer a relationship. It was a structure. And I needed to understand it before I dismantled it. Didn't call Daniel that day. I didn't text. Didn't ask a single question. When he called back in the evening, his voice was the same as always. Calm, familiar, as if nothing had happened. He asked if I had eaten. He said he would be home late. He said he missed me. I listened. I answered. My voice was so steady that it surprised even me. I didn't ask about the email. I didn't mention Portland. Didn't mention anything that I had seen. I let him talk. Then I realized something I had never noticed before. He said a lot, but he never said anything specific. Every answer was generic, every detail was vague, as if he was used to keeping a distance between his words and the truth. And for the first time, I wasn't drawn in. I just took note of it all. After the call, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, lit only by the light from the window, and I felt a very different kind of quiet. It was no longer the heavy silence of loneliness. It was the silence of someone who was planning. I placed a hand on my stomach, feeling the life inside me. And I knew that I was no longer just thinking for myself. I couldn't fall apart. I didn't have the right to. Not because I was strong, but because I had no other choice. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I wasn't going to expose everything all at once. Not yet. I'll let him believe that everything is still the same. I'll let him continue to live in a reality I now control. And in the meantime, I will watch. I will gather. I will understand. Because in any game, the winner isn't the stronger one. It's the one who sees more clearly. And for the first time since all this began, I'm no longer the passive one. I am learning how to see. And once I see the whole picture, I will know exactly what to do. Didn't rush into gathering evidence right away because after the initial shock, the greatest danger isn't a lack of information. It's acting on unstable emotions. So the first thing I did wasn't to search, but to choose the right person to trust. The only person who came to mind then was Rachel Monroe, my best friend from college, now a lawyer specializing in financial and asset disputes in Austin, the kind of person who never reacts emotionally before having all the facts and also someone I knew would never tell me what I wanted to hear, but only what I needed to hear. I called her that evening, my voice calmer than I'd expected. So calm that Rachel went silent for a few seconds before asking if I was sure I was okay. When I told her I had just discovered Daniel had another house, possibly another family, and financial transactions I had never known about, she didn't ask a single emotional question. She just said one very short thing. Don't do anything for the next 24 hours. Leave everything as it is and meet me tomorrow morning. The next morning, I went to Rachel's office, a glass building in the city center where everything was bright, tidy, and clear, a complete contrast to the chaos in my head. As soon as I put my phone on the table and opened all the emails, the attachments, the information I had found, Rachel said nothing for almost 10 minutes. She just read very slowly, very carefully, as if she were examining every last detail. When she looked up, her eyes were no longer those of a friend. They were the eyes of a lawyer. Elena, this isn't just about an affair. This is a deliberate financial structure. That sentence made me realize that what I had seen was only the surface. Rachel asked me to provide all the financial information I had access to, the joint account, tax records, investments, anything related to Daniel from the last 3 years. And while I opened my laptop, logging into each system, I started to realize something I had never noticed before. Daniel was always the one who handled the complicated things. He said I didn't need to bother with the tedious financial details, that he would take care of it, that we were a team. And I believed him. I let him manage most of the things I should have been overseeing myself. Rachel didn't say anything when I admitted that. She just nodded, as if this was nothing new to her, as if she had seen too many similar cases. We started with the simple things: the money transfers, the linked accounts, the transaction histories, and very quickly a pattern began to emerge. There were recurring transfers, not large enough to draw immediate attention, but regular enough to create a steady flow from our joint account to an entity I had never noticed before. Pacific Horizon Holdings. That name appeared again and again. At first, the amounts were small. Then they gradually increased. And then there were large transfers, very large, made at times I don't remember us ever discussing. Rachel asked me to stop when we found a specific transaction, a large money transfer from our joint account to another bank, accompanied by an approval document. She opened the file. It was a consent form. It had my signature on it. I stared at that signature for a long time. It looked like my signature, and almost perfect, but it wasn't mine. I knew it instantly, without needing to analyze it, without needing to compare it, because you always know when something bears your name, but wasn't created by you. I had never signed this document. Rachel didn't seem surprised. She just pushed her chair back a little, folded her arms, and looked directly at me. If this signature isn't yours, then it's a forgery. And if this money was used to buy assets outside of the marriage, then this goes far beyond a civil matter. I didn't react right away. I just sat there, looking at the screen, looking at my name placed somewhere I had never put it, and the feeling inside me was no longer shock. It was clarity. Daniel wasn't just us living two lives. He had used my life to build his other one. Rachel kept digging deeper. She pulled up real estate records in Oregon, searching by the address in the email, and in just a few minutes, we had information on the house, its value, its transaction history, and most importantly, how it was financed. The house wasn't bought directly with personal funds. It was purchased through a large loan, a loan secured by an asset. Rachel pulled up the mortgage document. I looked at the section for collateral, and I felt my entire body go cold. It was the building where my studio is located, the asset I had built over so many years, in my name. Daniel had no right to use it, unless. I didn't need Rachel to finish the sentence. Unless he had my signature. And if that signature was just like the one on the previous document, then he didn't just betray me. He stole from me. Not petty cash, but the very foundation of my life. I sat still, saying nothing, not moving, just feeling each layer of truth continue to reveal itself one by one, and each layer was deeper, colder, and more precise. Rachel finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Elena, you need to understand something clearly. This isn't a man who made a mistake. This is a man who has been planning for years. And if you make one wrong move, he will use this very system against you. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood. What I was facing wasn't a broken marriage. It was a system built to keep me out, and if I wanted to break it, I would have to understand it first. Completely. Didn't leave Rachel's office right after we discovered all of that, because at that moment, the most important thing was no longer emotion or outrage, but understanding exactly where I stood in the entire picture Daniel had been quietly building for years. Rachel closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and looked at me for a long time, not with the eyes of a worried friend, but of someone assessing a complex legal situation where every wrong step could make the whole game collapse. Elena, if you confront him now, you will lose. Not because you're weak, but because you don't have enough leverage yet. I didn't argue, because I had understood that even before she said it, and it was that very understanding that made me frighteningly calm. Daniel thinks he controls everything. He believes I know nothing, or if I do know, it's just a small part. More importantly, he believes that if this comes to light, he can spin it in a way that benefits him. A good lawyer doesn't just win with the truth, but by how they present the truth. And Daniel is a very good lawyer. So I wasn't going to give him the chance to play on his familiar ground. I was going to create a different one. He started building the plan right then and there. Not an emotional plan, but a series of calculated moves, each with a clear objective. And most importantly, no single step could reveal our true intentions. Assets were the first weakness. Not because money is more important than everything else, but because money is the one thing that can't lie when you shine the right light on it. And Daniel had left a trail, many trails. He just thought they were complex enough for no one to follow. Rachel started contacting a forensic auditor, someone who could trace the transactions, the shell companies, the hidden accounts, and map out the entire flow of money Daniel had used to maintain his second life. Didn't participate directly in that process. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to maintain my role on the outside. I was still the Elena that Daniel knew. The pregnant wife, tired, dependent, and completely unaware of what was happening. That was the facade I needed to maintain. Didn't change the way I spoke. I didn't change my habits. Didn't ask any questions that might make him suspicious. And he called, I answered. And he said he was busy, I nodded. And he said he'd be home late, I said it was fine. Every sentence was controlled. Every reaction was calculated. I wasn't acting, I was just eliminating unnecessary reactions. The legal side was the second weakness. Daniel might be good, but he'd also made mistakes. And his biggest mistake was believing that no one would check up on the things he'd done. And forging signatures, using assets that weren't his, creating financial structures to hide the flow of money. Those things weren't just marital problems. They were serious legal issues. But we didn't file a lawsuit right away, didn't report it, didn't make anything public. Because once that happened, Daniel would go on the defensive, and then he'd do what he does best, destroy, delay, and control the damage. I didn't want him on the defensive. I wanted him to stay on the offensive, to keep making mistakes, to keep believing he was safe. Reputation was the third weakness. Daniel didn't just have money. He had status, connections, an image he'd spent years building, and that was something he would try to protect at all costs. But a reputation can't hold up when the foundation beneath it is crumbling. And I knew that at the right moment, with just one push in the right place, that entire image would collapse in a way he couldn't control. I began to understand that my plan wasn't a single act. It was a process, a series of steps put in the right place, a system. It was like the system Daniel had built, but this time I was the architect. Rachel looked at me as we finished the first draft of the plan. The look in her eyes was no longer worry, but caution. "Elena, once you start this, you can't stop halfway through." I nodded. I had no intention of stopping. I had lost too much to go back to the beginning. I didn't need a loud revenge. I didn't need to hurt him directly. I just needed to do one thing: make everything he had built crumble. And to do that, I didn't need to be fast. I just needed to be precise. I left Rachel's office that afternoon, stepping out onto the street with a very different feeling than when I'd walked in. Not relief, not peace, but focus. Intense focus. I knew what I was going to do. I knew where I was going. But I also knew that the most important thing wasn't the plan. It was that Daniel could never know that I had one. And so that night, when he called me, his voice still familiar, still calm, still so in control, I listened just like I always did. I laughed when it was required. I answered when it was required. Kept everything right in its place. And throughout the entire call, he had no idea that the woman he was talking to was no longer the person he thought she was. The confrontation didn't happen like a normal argument. No yelling, no flurry of accusations, but as a silence so long and heavy that every breath became audible, as if the whole room was waiting for something inevitable. Daniel walked into the house with his familiar, confident, impeccable air, like a man who always believed he was in control of everything. He put his keys on the table, took off his coat, and glanced around quickly, as if checking that everything was still under his command. Then he looked at me. That look wasn't one of concern, but of assessment. It was the habit of a person who always calculates the other's reaction, who always has an answer ready before the question is even asked. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, even completely controlled. I nodded, slowly, deliberately. Fine." We sat across from each other. The distance between us was the same, but the feeling was completely different. It was as if there was no longer a table between us but a line, and with just one word, everything would collapse. He started to speak. Still about work. Still about the pressure. Still the same familiar explanations that I used to believe, to nod along to use to reassure myself whenever something felt wrong. But this time, I said nothing. I didn't nod. I didn't react. I just looked at him, long enough for the silence to start making him uncomfortable. He paused, very slightly, but it was enough to reveal a crack in his control. "Is something wrong?" he asked again, his voice slower, more cautious. I looked straight at him, without flinching. "Do you want to tell the truth, or should I?" My words weren't loud or harsh, but they landed heavily, like something that could never be taken back. He smiled, that familiar reflex, the smile he always used to smooth things over, to stay in control. "I don't know what you're talking about." I didn't answer. I placed the phone on the table, turned the screen toward him, opened the first email, and just left it there. No explanation. No introduction. Just letting him look. His eyes scanned the screen, fast, very fast, like someone trying to read and control their expression at the same time. But then he stopped, and in that moment, I could see clearly that he understood. But he still wouldn't admit it. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling lightly, trying to keep his rhythm. "This is a work document. You're misunderstanding." His voice was still even, but it was no longer steady. I didn't argue. I opened the next file. As a contract. His name. That other woman's name. An address. This time he didn't speak right away. He looked longer. Long enough that he could no longer pretend it wasn't important. And it was that very hesitation that gave everything away. He took a breath, then said, his voice lower now, "This is more complicated than you think. I can explain." I nodded. "Then explain." But before he could continue, I had opened the third email. Short lines of text. Unmistakable. No room for misunderstanding. And this time, the change in him was no longer subtle. It was obvious. His eyes wavered, just for a second, but it was enough to shatter the entire facade he had maintained since he walked through the door. He stood up, paced a few steps, then turned back, as if trying to find his place in this situation again. "When did you see these?" he asked. Not to find out, but to regain control. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch on long enough to make his question meaningless. "You want to continue?" I asked. There was no need to force it. No need to raise my voice. All I had to do was hold his gaze. He stopped cold. Completely. And that was the moment I knew one thing for sure. He was no longer in control. He walked closer to the table, leaned on his hands, and looked straight at me. For the first time, there was no distance, no facade, just a man trying to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers. "Can fix this," he said, faster now, more urgent, as if speaking quickly enough would put everything back in its place. He talked about money, about assets, about transfers, about solutions. But he didn't talk about the most important thing. He didn't talk about the other woman. He didn't talk about the children. He didn't talk about the life he had hidden. He was avoiding it. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. I slid the last file across the table toward him. The transactions. The payments. And the signature. It's my name. But I wasn't the one who had signed it. He looked down. And this time, everything stopped. There were no more words that could cover it up. He looked up, his voice completely changed. No longer calm, no longer in control. "You have no idea what you're doing." I shook my head, slowly, deliberately. "No. You're the one who has no idea." The room grew heavy, dense, as if everything had been pulled back to its true nature. No more pretending. No more distance. Just the truth. He started talking faster, trying to explain, trying to pull things back, but every sentence he spoke only exposed him more, because this time I wasn't listening with trust. I was listening with clarity. And when he stopped, when there was nothing left to say, I spoke. "I don't need you to fix this." He looked at me, not understanding. I pushed the stack of papers toward him. "I just need you to sign." He turned each page. Slower, heavier, and every expression on his face changed with every line of text, as if he was realizing, piece by piece, the truth he could no longer control. He looked up, his eyes no longer hiding anything. "This is a trap." I looked straight at him. "No, this is the result." And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. The man in front of me was no longer the one in control of the game. He was just a man standing in the middle of something he had created. And for the first time, I was the one who would decide how it ended. Things didn't collapse all at once with a loud crash. There was no dramatic scene like people imagine, but rather a slow, orderly, and cruel process in the way that only systems built on lies can fall apart. Daniel didn't sign it that night. He pushed the stack of papers towards me, stood up, trying to regain his composure, trying to hold on to some part of the image he was so used to, projecting for all those years, but I could see it clearly. That layer of control had cracked, and he knew it. He left without another word. No apology. No admission. No explanation. He just left, like the final reflex of someone who still believed he could come back and fix everything later. But I didn't wait. The next morning, things began to move. Rachel filed the papers. Not a divorce petition, not right away, but the documents necessary to freeze the financial structures Daniel had built. The shell companies, the money flows, the assets that had been moved through multiple layers to avoid attention. Once that system was touched, it no longer ran smoothly. The banks started demanding verification. The accounts were put under review. The loans were called into question. And most importantly, the signatures that Daniel once thought were perfect began to be examined from a legal perspective. In just a few days, the first thing he lost wasn't money. It was control. He called me. Many times. Didn't pick up. He texted. At first, he kept a calm tone, which then shifted to explaining, then to persuading, and finally to demanding. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because for the first time, I no longer needed to react. Rachel handled the legal side. The financial experts handled the cash flow. Just had to hold my position. A few days later, Daniel showed up again. No longer in a perfect suit, no longer with that same confident air as before, but as a man who was beginning to understand that things were slipping from his grasp faster than he had anticipated. He spoke differently. No more beating around the bush. The shell was gone, he confessed. Not all of it, but enough. He talked about mistakes, about the pressure, about how things had gone too far. He said he would fix it. He said he would transfer the assets. He said he would end things in Portland. But this time, those words meant nothing. Not because I wasn't listening, but because I understood the way he speaks. He doesn't tell the truth. He says whatever it takes to keep himself in the game. And that game was over. The following weeks were a series of events that wouldn't have seemed dramatic from the outside. But if you were on the inside, you could see every single layer being peeled away. His law firm started to get pulled in, not because anyone wanted to make a scene, but because his financial transactions were directly linked to the very system they were responsible for overseeing. His senior partner can't get involved in things like forging signatures and the illegal use of assets without consequences. He was temporarily suspended. Then came an internal investigation. Then he lost his position. Not in one day, but step by step. His reputation didn't collapse immediately, but it cracked. And in the world he lived in, a small crack was enough for everything else to come crumbling down on its own. On the Portland side of things, the story didn't unfold the way he wanted, either. Didn't have to confront the other woman. I didn't have to go there. The truth just had to be put in the right place, with the right people, at the right time, and everything would sort itself out. She left. Not because I forced her to, but because she realized that the life she was living wasn't what she thought it was. And when that foundation disappeared, there was nothing left to hold on to. Daniel lost on both fronts, not in a single moment, but in a process that he couldn't stop. The money was frozen. The assets were put under review. Whatever was in my name was separated out. That he tried to hide was dragged into the light. And for the first time, he had no way to control the narrative. Legally, everything went according to process. Not fast, not slow, and precise. And by the time it was all over, Daniel didn't have much left to keep. Not because I took everything, but because most of what he had was never really legally his in the first place. As for me, I didn't feel victorious. There was no sense of satisfaction like you hear about in revenge stories. Just a different kind of silence. It was no longer heavy, no longer suffocating. Instead, it was a clean space, a place where it are stored over. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't remember, but because I understood enough. Some things, once they've fallen, don't need to be rebuilt. You just need to walk away. And this time, I was the one who walked out first. My new life didn't begin with a major turning point. There was no clear moment marking that everything had ended and a new chapter had begun. Instead, it arrived slowly, almost silently, like morning light seeping through the curtains, not loud, but enough for you to realize the night is over. I continued to live in the old house for a while after that, not because I couldn't leave, but because I wanted to see it one last time, from a different perspective. Not as a place that held memories, but as a space I had once filled with my faith, and I now understood that its value wasn't in what had happened, but in the fact that I was strong enough to walk away from it. That my mornings changed. No longer waiting for someone to come down to the kitchen, no longer listening for familiar footsteps, no longer checking my phone every time it buzzed. It was simply waking up, taking a deep breath, and feeling the quiet in a different way, no longer heavy, no longer making me feel a sense of loss, but a manageable emptiness. I went back to work, not immediately at the old pace, but one step at a time, slow but steady, the way you would rebuild a structure that was once broken, more carefully, more consciously, and most importantly, without ever handing control over to anyone else again. My studio was still there. The projects were still waiting. But this time, I worked with a different mindset. No longer trying to prove anything. No longer chasing perfection. Just doing it right, doing enough, and keeping everything within my own hands. I moved out of that house a few months later to a smaller, simpler place. Not because I needed to downsize my life, but because I wanted to start again from a space that held no traces of the past. An apartment with good light, a small corner for my desk, and a balcony big enough for me to sit on each evening, looking down at the city, not thinking too much, not trying to find answers for things that were over. Didn't keep track of Daniel. I didn't ask about him. Didn't try to find out where he was, what he was doing, what he had lost, or what he had managed to keep. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I no longer needed to know. Some stories, once they're finished, don't give you more understanding by going back to examine every detail. They only pull you back to a version of yourself you've already left behind. Didn't want to go back there. Didn't talk about what happened with many people. Not because I was ashamed, but because I understood that not everyone needed to know, and not every story needs to be told to have value. The value lies in what you learned from it. And I have learned enough. I learned that self-respect isn't a feeling, but a decision, a choice that's repeated every day in how you allow others to treat you, in how you react when things don't go your way, and in how you walk away when you know you no longer belong there. I learned that love, if not accompanied by honesty, is just a decorated version of control, and if you're not careful, you can spend years living in a story where you are not the main character. And most importantly, I understood that someone who masters their emotions isn't someone who feels no pain, but someone who doesn't let that pain dictate their actions. I used to think that strength was about holding on, about enduring, about fixing things that were broken. But now I know, sometimes real strength lies in stopping, looking the truth straight in the eye, and choosing to walk away without needing anyone's approval. The truth doesn't need to be shouted to have value. It just needs to be put in its rightful place. And when it's put in its rightful place, whatever was built on lies will collapse on its own, without you having to push it. In the evening, when I sit alone on the balcony, a gentle breeze blows, the city below still bright, still noisy, still carrying on as it always does. I no longer feel like I'm on the outside of life. I am in it, in my own way. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time in so many years, that is enough. If you've stayed with me until now, perhaps you've been through something similar, or at least, you've had doubts, felt that something wasn't right, but convinced yourself to ignore it. This story isn't to talk about betrayal, but to remind you of something simple yet so easy to forget. When you start to doubt your own feelings, it's not a sign that you're weak, but a sign that you need to stop and see things more clearly. You don't have to win against anyone. You don't have to prove anything. You just need to be clear-headed enough not to lose yourself in a story that doesn't belong to you. If this story means something to you, please take a moment to think about yourself, about what you're accepting, about how you're being treated, and most importantly, about whether you are respecting yourself. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories not just to be heard but to be understood, please subscribe to the channel. Again, we'll meet again